Hi. So I'm going to try to give people a couple minutes to filter in, but this installment of the Jacobin YouTube stay-at-home series is going to feature Professor Sam Moyn, who's going to be talking about human rights and social and economic rights and how to think about all of that. I am filling in for Bhaskar today because he is as a place without a great internet connection. I'm also going to be saying a few words about Michael Brooks before this starts out. Also, as we're kind of waiting for people, should mention that on Friday there's going to be a stay-at-home with the historian, political commentator, Jacobin contributing editor, all-around excellent person, Matt Karp. Going to be talking about Lincoln's paramilitary, the Wide Awakes, and that one's going to be hosted by another Matthew Stanley. But I guess what I want to say right now is that the last thing that was aired on this channel was the last episode of Weekends with Michael Brooks and Anna Kasparian, and obviously Michael was hugely important to Jacobin, and this channel was his idea originally, way back in 2017, and it was just getting started. And obviously, we're going to continue the project, but the exact form it takes in the future without his contributions is yet to be seen, right? But there is still, this is still going to exist and expand, and like all of the many projects that Michael was involved in, we're going to be keeping this going and going further, trying to continue his legacy and in that way, and we're going to be doing a tribute show for Michael on Saturday when his weekend show would have normally aired at 1, with his co-host Anna Kasparian and his friend Nando Vila. So you should tune into that. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe for this right now. I guess, anything that I can say feels grotesquely inadequate to the scale of the loss. I would just say personally that it would be impossible for me to overstate how much knowing Michael and working and collaborating in many ways with Michael has meant to me in the last 2 years. Obviously professionally, certainly politically, and in terms of influencing my worldview. I got very used to leaning on his instincts, his impressions, and personally, it feels cheesy and cliched to say that Michael was like a brother to me, but that is literally accurate to how I felt, and what that relationship was like. He just is one of certainly the funniest human being I've ever known, and also one of the most committed and driven and intellectually curious. And the loss is enormous, and he's irreplaceable. But I know it's tough to transition from that to any other subject. But I do want to say So Sam Moyn is a professor of law and history at Yale University. He's a contributor to Jacobin. He's the author of several books, including Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. And he is going to be talking about us today about why human rights is important but not enough, necessary but not sufficient, and some of the core arguments in his book. So take it away, Sam.
All right. Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me, and thanks to people for listening. First off, condolences to Ben and everyone. It's a terrible tragedy, and the outpouring online around Michael Brooks's death has been extraordinary. I barely knew him, but ironically was supposed to tape with him tomorrow, and the kind of learning that we all got from his shows has been incredible. So it's such a loss. So as Ben said, it's a tough transition, but I'm gonna ask what the problem is with human rights, what progressives or socialists should think about them, and as he said, I'm going to suggest they're good things, but not good enough, not enough on their own. So let me start in the past, since I'm basically a historian, with the beginning of the human rights phenomenon and movement as we know it, which occurred in the 1970s. And I like to start with a speech that a Czech dissident named Zdena Tominova gave. She was born in Prague, and she grew up as a child under the new communist regime starting in the mid-40s. And yet she became a dissident, and indeed she helped co-found really the one of the most famous new human rights outfits of the 1970s that was invoking that concept. She suffered for it. She had her head smashed into the pavement by secret police, and as a result, she was invited by the regime to take a vacation that later became permanent. And at that time, around 1980, she gave a talk in Dublin, and she surprised her listeners there because she didn't denounce communism exactly, and definitely not socialism. She said that it was terrible that a socialism had become an alibi for the denial of some basic human rights, like the right to speak freely and organize. But she also recalled what it had meant to be taken beyond a class society in her childhood of the 1940s, and in particular, to feel what it was like to have the same privileges as everyone else, no more than anyone else, but also no fewer. She wasn't illusioned about what communist rule was like, but she said it would also be terrible if we let the idea of human rights replace socialism and become a kind of alibi for the abandonment of socialism, and especially the redistribution of income and wealth and all the good things that we get from having them. Well, that hope that she expressed, that we could get human rights and socialism together, now that there was a movement transnationally defending human rights, is not what happened. In fact, if you look at just the history of language, at the chart I want to show you, you have to imagine this Czech dissident saying basically, oh shit. Just when she was speaking the idea of socialism in language, in English, but Google allows us to check all languages, or at least a lot of them, that idea of socialism was peaking. Now, all that means is that people were saying the word way more often than ever before, and now even. They could have been for or against it, but socialism, the word was prominent in language. Human rights had never been And yet, at that very moment when she spoke, socialism was about to tank, and human rights was about to skyrocket. And my generation, since I'm assuming that most listeners are much younger than me, really surfed on that wave of enthusiasm for human rights, talking a lot about them and a lot more about human rights than about socialism. And that change, as you see, occurred in the 1970s. So why did that happen? I mean, that's basically what I want to ask and give you some ideas. It's a complicated story, but I think it was a loss. Now that data I showed you only goes up to around 2008, and we know that a lot changed then, and that doesn't kind of reflect what's happening in our time with Bernie and Basker and all the rest who have made socialism something live again. It wasn't in my youth, and it's an extraordinary thing. And yet, I think we can say that we're still living in a kind of age of human rights where lots of people focus their reform aspirations and energies, if they mobilize, around some set of basic rights, which they define in some way or other. So I'm going to tell a little story about what happened in that recent period, but we should obviously acknowledge that even if that phrase human rights really were some of the only people who use it in kind of the broad sweep of history, the idea of rights is old. What we say about human rights has to depend on how we define that idea, what content we give it. At the very least, we would say that there's a very old idea that individuals, because they're human, have some non-negotiable entitlements that their community and state can't trample. And there's a long history of that idea. It was a big deal in the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But as we know, those rights tended to be described very narrowly, not a long list, and only a narrow set of people got them, white men, for the longest time. It was in part because the whole idea of rights was so closely connected to the defense of free contract and property, which has helped those who had and not those who didn't, that one of the first socialists, Karl Marx, could dismiss the whole idea of human rights. But we also know that long ago in the 19th century, there were early versions of workers' rights. Workers' movements and common people's movements did define things like a right to work, to employment. Lots of rights we know about that the labor movement brought us that humanized the workplace, provided limited hours, excluded children from work, never perfectly or enough. And in the 20th century, especially, we saw lots of what we call welfare rights, basic entitlements, not just to speak or to associate, but to things like food, healthcare, sanitation. And it's really since the 1970s that what we call the history of economic and social rights has seen a kind of major development. Movements focus on it, mainstream human rights movements, especially today. And there's human rights law. And so what I want to talk about in my last half is sort of what we should say about all that relative to a broader progressive politics or socialist movement. One topic I'm going to skip in the history of human rights that you may be interested in is whether they're an imperialist concept, because in my youth, they were associated with and cited in justification of some interventions by great powers in places like Kosovo, or Iraq. And in Jacobin, among other places, there's been lots of discussion of what the left should think about human rights, given their potential for being taken in an imperial direction, especially their connection with U.S. imperialism. And I'm really glad to talk about that topic, and would love to pursue it with you. What I want to focus on now, for the lecture itself, is economics. Kind of what are the distributive implications of the human rights movement today, and what should progressives or socialists think about it? So to do that, I want to just tell you about a basic distinction that I think is really useful for facing this question for the left. And it's the distinction between sufficiency and equality. Now, let me explain what those two concepts mean. If I'm for sufficient provision, whether in terms of economic and social rights or in some other framework, like a universal basic income, I'm saying there's a threshold of stuff that each person should get. In the case of a UBI, it's money on an annual basis. In the case of economic and social rights, if we look at our human rights law, we find that there's a statement that everyone should get enough of certain basic decencies: food, water, work, and so forth. Healthcare, to take one that's been so important because of Bernie Sanders in American politics. And there's a possibility that we would take those entitlements, what I'm calling sufficient provision, as the most important thing or the only important thing. And there have been people who've done that. A good example is Thomas Paine, who helped start the American Revolution, was involved in the French Revolution, who outright says at a certain point in his career, I don't care how rich the rich are, as long as the poor are taken out of poverty. And that's been an immensely important idea that has been part of the age of human rights. What he's saying, and what a later thinker living today, Harry Frankfurt, became well known for saying, is that equality doesn't matter. As long as we help the poor out of poverty, it doesn't matter if there's inequality left. It's not of independent moral concern or political concern. There shouldn't be movements to challenge how rich the rich are getting, even if the poor are getting better off. Now, of course, if you hear that, I'm hoping you're siding with me and worrying that sufficient provision sounds good, but it's not enough, and that we should hold out for equality, that it also matters whether we live in hierarchy, whether in America or in some other national setting or in global terms. And what I want to do is talk about how the human rights movement has been part of the era of neoliberalism, because it's focusing more or less solely on sufficient provision, and has lost sight of more fairness overall. So if we think back, just to get a picture of how this happened, before the 1970s, back in the 1940s, especially, when that Czech dissident spoke, but also in the West, thanks to social democrats in Western Europe, or Franklin Roosevelt in the United States, there was a welfare state created. No one should be nostalgic about it. There were a lot of economic and social rights talked about. FDR gave a famous speech propounding a second Bill of Rights, saying one should be added to the US Constitution that mentioned some of those basic economic and social rights that I told you about before. But we should never forget that the welfare state was exclusionary. These, in the European cases, were mostly empires. They didn't provide welfare to their imperial subjects and fought brutal wars to keep some of those imperial territories. And at home, of course, these welfare states, including the not very impressive American one, were also exclusionary. They really focused on the male breadwinner and the white male breadwinner at that. And yet we can say that welfare states did not lose sight of equality. They were about the most basic decencies from place to place, always within a national community. There was socialism in one country in the communist world, but welfarism in one country across the Atlantic and in some ways in Latin America. And that was the moment we know that equality in general was kept in bounds. There was still immense hierarchy. But my point is that we can look back to the welfare state as a time when there were unions and socialist parties that insisted that the rich come down to be part of the rest. It didn't just matter to provide sufficient provision or to build a floor for the worst off or the workers. It also mattered to bring a ceiling down and to advance equality. And we know that it happened. We can debate why it happened between the 40s and the 70s. We can even say that when we look back at this big event in the history of human rights in the 1940s, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was propounded by the United Nations in December 1948, it was kind of as a charter for welfare states. The idea was that every state, every nation would strive for sufficient provision. That's why all the economic and social rights are already listed there, but also some kind of equality of citizenship, including distributional equality. The idea of human rights didn't become famous then, but instead that happened later. And the UDHR became not a charter for welfare states at home, but very often, and especially for Americans, a document for caring about mobilizing on behalf, especially of foreigners. It's amazing even today for Americans that the phrase human rights does not normally mean our entitlements, changing our entitlements. Bernie has tried to change that, of course, by saying repeatedly, healthcare is a human right. And he's gotten, the Democrats, most of them, to at least say that. But most often Americans have referred to their own commitments, racial equality in terms of civil rights, and have used the idea of human rights to refer to what the American state should be doing and what private citizens should be doing. New non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch should be doing elsewhere. And we know that that language serves all comers. A couple days ago, some of you may have noticed that our Secretary of State in this country, Mike Pompeo, issued a report, or had a commission issue a report with a very right-wing version of how the American state should pursue human rights abroad. What I want to kind of conclude with is thinking about what that development, the explosion of human rights consciousness, and especially law and movements like Human Rights Watch, has meant for our distributional aspirations across the world. So we can't ignore, first off, that the very moment that Czech dissident spoke was the moment that neoliberalism kicked off. It had come to Chile in 1973. Just when she was speaking, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were winning across the Atlantic and really conquered the world. And I think what that's meant in if we look at world history, at various places at different times, various nations, but also at the international level through international financial institutions like the World Bank, is that reform has privileged a a um, a destruction of any egalitarian constraint. Sometimes it's added a concern for sufficient provision, since we know that that global poverty became a huge concern, which is, of course, about people getting the basic decencies, or at least some of them. And yet that concern, like the cause of human rights itself, became popular in a moment of expanding inequality in many places. I like to show a couple of charts on the Chinese situation, since many people, many neoliberals, justify neoliberalism by pointing out that the Chinese state marketizing has saved more human beings from extreme poverty than at any time in world history. If you like, you could say that the Chinese have had at least some of their economic and social rights vindicated, no longer starving. Some floor of protection has been built for them to the tune of hundreds of millions of people. Now, we shouldn't get too excited, not as excited as many neoliberals, because these are findings that are primarily about bringing the Chinese peasantry and informal proletariat over a very low threshold of so-called extreme poverty, which the World Bank defines as $1 and change a day. Still, it's an achievement, but to bring hundreds of millions from extreme poverty to poverty, we can debate, the measurement and numbers. The important point is that in this same period, even beyond the explosion of American inequality in income, Chinese inequality has skyrocketed even more. And it's sort of like the economic signature of our age, that not everywhere, certainly not in Africa, sufficient provision has improved, while distributive inequality has worsened. The poor are a little better off, the rich are a lot better off. And these facts have led me to kind of my conclusion that we should, ask some critical questions about human rights. Why did socialism die in the age of human rights, which was also the age of neoliberalism? And we have to have an answer to that question. And we also have to have an answer to the question why human rights could survive and thrive as a cause in the age of neoliberalism. And my basic answer to both questions is that socialism was incompatible with neoliberalism, but human rights were not. Here's why. If you like, human rights really haven't had a lot to say about distribution for a long time at all. The American and really North Atlantic human rights outfits really didn't talk about economic and social rights for a really long time, focusing on free speech or false imprisonment or torture. They changed their tune really recently. And even when they did change their tune and focused on the economic and social rights in the Universal Declaration or in later human rights law, those are about getting people who don't have sufficient provision to that threshold of enough. There's really no right in human rights law to equality. There's rights to equality of races and sexes, but not to income or wealth. And the idea is that human rights gave us a language for talking about some problems rather than others, even when human rights were intersecting with distribution. They were about building a floor, sometimes a low floor, and they didn't allow us to see, let alone target, the fact that the rich in the age of human rights were really obliterating any ceiling on how high they could rise. So that's in my view, that's what we're fighting. As progressives or socialists, we're trying to return equality locally and globally to the fore, and adding it to the concerns that human rights and the age of human rights made so vivid. But we have to make sure to hew to Tominova's vision, human rights and socialism, rather than the one that has prevailed really in a neoliberal era, human rights instead of socialism. So let me just conclude, because I've reached the end of what of the time I wanted to take, really to leave everyone time to challenge and question. We're in the age of Trump, not just the age of neoliberalism, but the age of a wave of authoritarianism, which we can debate whether it's fascist and so forth. But there's no doubt we're seeing the kinds of challenges that we thought we'd mastered to human rights. And a lot of people have said that we should double down on human rights. And, they're right, that we should stand up for human rights, in my opinion. A good example would be the current leader of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, who said that the rise of Trump and other authoritarians, even when Pompeo issues his own human rights philosophy, we need to stand up for basic civil liberties as well as economic and social rights for the worst off. And no wonder that Bernie gained so much traction by demanding, as his programs basically do, sufficient provision. And yet we know that he, like no American politician in recent history, didn't rest content with that focus when he condemned the victory of the rich in our time. And so my conclusion is that we need to unlearn some of the lessons that I learned a little bit older than most of you. In the 1990s, at the end of history, I was taught that human rights were the bulwark against barbarism, and we just had to fight for them to keep barbarism at bay. And that's proved mistaken, deeply mistaken. So instead, I conclude that human rights are good but not enough. And of course, the real alternative to barbarism is socialism. Now, just to close with a couple of ideas, not everyone agrees with this perspective already. And we have to have some arguments for why it's not good enough to hold out with some basic minimum, whether in rights terms or as a universal basic income. Why it is that we think that hierarchy is a wrong, even when it's not leading to other kinds of failures. But there's another argument I think we can make, which may be really appealing in the current moment, which is that people get angry when they live in hierarchy. And the reason always that socialism was the real alternative to barbarism wasn't just that in the absence of socialist movements, governments would be barbaric, but also that people who weren't getting fairness in other ways would lash out at victims, choose demagogic politicians, and what used to be called the socialism of fools. And I strongly believe, just in conclusion, that we should add human rights to this broader progressive vision, because if we don't, human rights themselves are at stake, as well as egalitarian values we should also care about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. That was really good. Before we get into some broader philosophical and historical questions about this, wanted to and questions from the chat. I wanted to kick it off by asking, a general question, about, like just a distinction that might seem kind of trivial, but is worth making, which is something that our producer Kale was talking about when we were chatting before we started broadcasting, which is between like capital H, capital R, human rights, TM, right, and rights that we think that people should have as humans, right? So like an analogy that you could make is to the way that people talk about anti-racism, and of course there's being against racism as any decent human being would be, and there's anti-racism, which aren't necessarily always the same thing, or you might have ideological quibbles, about some of the things that people mean in some contexts. And I would imagine you would make similar distinctions about human rights. So take that in whatever direction you want. I just wanted to give you a chance to talk on that.
Absolutely. No, it's a crucial point. I'm not sure how far we should take it. So here's why. So that data I showed you was measuring human rights as anyone was defining them. And of course, as far back as we can go, at least till, the early modern period, maybe the Middle Ages, people have been saying that individuals have rights, different about what they were, the reasons they have them, and so forth. And we should then, if you like, reserve the right to define human rights in the way we want. But we can't ignore that human rights became famous and people even began to speak about them with a small h and a small r at a certain point in history because of the victory of a mainstream. And that mainstream did define human rights narrowly. And we have to kind of figure out where it went wrong before we can figure out how to struggle to reclaim human rights. We also have to take seriously people on the left, starting with the granddaddy of them all, Karl Marx, who said, the fact that the bourgeoisie own and operate human rights mean you can't use the phrase anymore. You can't redefine it and pretend that they don't, serve the bourgeoisie rather than the proletariat. Now, I think he was wrong about that. But all I'm suggesting is that we have to take seriously how the dominant have used these ideas, human rights and other ideas like a class-free anti-racism, before we can challenge what they've done. I even think it's kind of misleading to say the human rights idea is being abused. Well, the fact is that we want to abuse it and take it in a different direction from the dominant way it's been used, especially by Americans, politicians, and movement activists.
Yeah, and actually, the part about Karl Marx, makes me curious about a couple of things. So, in your talk, you contrasted the threshold conception of economic human rights, as long as nobody's starving, everybody, maybe has clean water and sanitation, and perhaps at the outer edge of this discourse, healthcare.
Right.
Then it doesn't really matter if there are these obscene wealth inequalities. And so one way to frame this is just, okay, so there are two values that we have. One is human rights and one is equality. But certainly there's also a tradition going back to 19th century labor Republicans, going back to Karl Marx himself, thinking about his instructions, the First International, where he talks about replacing the despotic system of subordination of labor to the Republican and beneficent system of the Association of Free Producers, of thinking about our objection to economic inequality, not just in terms of the value of equality, but in terms of the value of freedom. That if there are these massive wealth inequalities, then people are more susceptible to unreasonable forms of domination by others. And so I was curious about your thoughts about that, and maybe the connection between these three concepts, right? Right. Human rights in the sense that it's used now, equality, and freedom.
Great. No, fantastic question. So first, just just to begin, I hope no one is hearing either of us trivializing some of the basic rights, even if it turns out they're about a threshold. I mean, consider the way that the international right to water could be useful to the citizens of Flint, Michigan, who could invoke it, and they're not getting at equality, even though their situation is deeply unequal and racialized to boot. But they have this right to water, which they can invoke to some effect. But your point's a great one. So, I'm with you. I mean, we can adopt a small r Republican view that what we should care about is non-exploitation or domination, especially in labor, which is so central to the lives of everyone practically. And what that would mean is raising the question, well, how much inequality is compatible with non-domination or non-exploitation. We know that if I don't have enough food, if I can't speak freely because someone's gagging me, I'm not free relative to those who can, and I'm in a hierarchy that makes it, basically impossible for me to not be dominated. But we might say, well, we should keep our movements and our ideas, inspiring movements, focused on when we're equal enough in terms of power. And I think that's a great conception. I mean, I guess, my defense of focusing on distribution of income and wealth is that, traditionally the left cares about those things precisely because we need proxies to know when is there domination, when is there exploitation. And the kind of philosophical point is that you can imagine folks who've reached some threshold, especially a low threshold of sufficient provision, they have the water and so forth, who still, want to make a claim that they're being dominated and they're being exploited. And in the book, I imagine a kind of world in which our overlords have provided us with all of our human rights, but they own everything and us nothing. And that's compatible with human rights, but not with domination. And so the idea is that we care about distribution, including more equal distribution, because it helps us make the case that there's domination or exploitation, and we need to remedy those things. Because otherwise, how do we know it when we see it? But in argument, in our programmatic thinking, in our legislation, we need to have some index. And the suggestion is that this is a pretty good one. And it's become famous thanks to Thomas Piketty at Ad Infinitum, because the evidence is so graphic that the age of human rights has been the age of expanding inequality, not just of domination in the abstract, but of income and wealth in numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I would think, I think a little bit about the kind of arc of the late Christopher Hitchens, who started out, of course, as a socialist,
right,
and spent decades talking about human rights abuses in proxy states for American empire, around the world. But one way of understanding his arc is that going back to your graph of the two, the line going up and the line going down, there's this sort of admirable in many ways human rights cosmopolitanism, became sort of his entire thing, especially
right,
after he kind of gave up on socialism. And of course, not to turn this into a simplistic cautionary fable, because that would be ridiculous, but that's certainly an instance of something you alluded to in the talk, which is that it has often been very easy for this kind of discourse to be weaponized by imperialism.
Absolutely. And that's such a familiar trajectory. And I'm grateful that people in your generation aren't experiencing its appeals anymore, because in the 90s, when I was in my 20s, it still was it's a credible set of things to start thinking about. Because if you've defined human rights, if you've given up on socialism and defined human rights in terms of things that are violated by despots abroad, your natural question is, well, what agent is going to stop it? And at the end of history, at a moment of increasing American unilateralism, if the country's going to war anyway, more and more, why not have it do so for a good cause? And a lot of people got caught up in that, and I hope it's staying and tarnished a lot of reputations, because the trouble is we have a lot of folks who are probably in line to serve in Joe Biden's cabinet who believed all of that and actually did under Barack Obama as well. So, all of us who are concerned about that possibility need both to attack, what our elders, the journey they went on, but also, think very seriously about, well, what's our alternative? If we think human rights matter, along with a lot of other values, what's the international system that we advocate? It's clearly not American empire, but what is it? And that would take us in a different direction. And I wish I had more to say on it, because I think it's essential that we have some sort of program.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick shout out to contributing editor Daniel Bessner, who's probably thought more about that last question that you were raising than anybody I know. I want to take a couple.
He and I are part of this Quincy Institute, which is focused on restraint first and foremost. So, we're first saying do no harm, but we're getting a little bit less clarity on what is the help that's provided once the harm is stopped.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, I think just the fact that there are serious leftists who are grappling with that now is an incredibly encouraging sign, because there was obviously an era, and I say era as if we were talking about, 100 years ago, but, like 2010, right? When the thought of the left being in power so it would ever have to grapple with these questions was so impossibly distant that it almost felt silly to deal with them. But I do want to loop in a couple of questions from the chat, especially some of the ones that I thought were kind of interestingly contrarian or presented challenges. So, viewer Chris, I guess the username, asks, what good are rights if they can't stop people from violating them? So, I mean, this is kind of a familiar radical critique of, rights talk of all kinds, really, not just this kind of human rights discourse, this like sort of words on paper critique, that you can have that UN Declaration of Human Rights, but people in Flint still don't have clean drinking water. So what good is it doing us?
Right. No, and if they were purely, I mean, my critique is really that human rights are too often kind of a palliative, but this is a deeper critique, which is that they're a substitute for actually providing the substance named by the right. So I'm a bit skeptical of that for a few reasons. First, some rights have been vindicated better, never perfectly, in some places at some times, rather than worse at others. And, there's the question, well, compared to what? No one should think that we just, engage without any concept or slogan. And all of them formulated in advance will not yet have been vindicated. So if we call for socialism, we'd have to say what we mean by it. But we could say, oh, it's meaningless because it's not self-realizing or self-vindicating. But no one ever said any concept is going to have that property. Now, I do think the comment is of extraordinary importance, and the left has been central to showing over the last 2 centuries that not really or so much rights matter as the conditions for their enjoyment. Mm-hmm. And that's a profound idea that I think we just haven't taken the measure of it. Even to the extent it's plausible, we have to say, well, we need to know, what is the entitlement for which we're providing the conditions, and how do we get people in the room, part of our movements, to share in pushing for those conditions. And I guess the basic idea is we need concepts and slogans that are exciting, that are morally appealing or even persuasive compared to others. And so, the comment is right on. It's just that I think it maybe should be made more precise so that we kind of grapple with the difficult issue of how we use rights to provide, the non-dominating conditions under which people actually enjoy them rather than just say they have them.
Right, and certainly something you alluded to in the talk was the tradition of labor rights, which
Correct.
is especially relevant maybe here, because of course that's a tradition of rights talk that comes with an agency that's supposed to
Correct.
bring it about.
Right.
But maybe to kind of steer back to kind of core human rights discourse, Simon Thistlewood in the chat has a question where he refers to Hannah Arendt's phrase "the right to have rights," and I think what he's asking about, what his question is, maybe one way of thinking about it is, earlier we were talking about the ways that human rights discourse can be weaponized by imperialism, but it seems like there are clearly contexts in which this can be useful to people with an anti-imperial project, particularly, for example, stateless Palestinian refugees currently denied, that right to have rights.
Sure. Absolutely. Just one word on labor rights, which is that they're in that small r Republican vein, unlike the welfare rights I mentioned, housing, water, health, and so forth. Labor rights are really about empowerment for the sake of changing society, for the sake of everyone, and not just for sufficient provision of like a shorter workday and so forth. So labor rights, which have been really neglected by human rights law and movements, are ones I think ought to be taken the most seriously. It's absolutely true that human rights law so far is really embarrassing when it comes to the stateless and those who are especially economic migrants, because it allows entry even when there are states that are willing to hear their claims, only under real narrow conditions. There has to be a well-founded fear of persecution, based on 5 narrow grounds: racial persecution, religious persecution. And so, there's no right to have rights, as Hannah Arendt put it. And that's why her focus was, I don't think she was really on the left. It was a version of that left-wing point that we should care equally or more about the conditions for the enjoyment of rights. And for those who have no community, her point was they have to have a place that provides them citizenship. So that's that's an immense project to think about what that would mean. Of course, we could say we should renovate the Human Rights Project and beef up the Refugee Convention, and there are projects in that regard. I mean, I think we need to, ultimately rethink the whole international system, which raises lots of intricate issues about, well, how do we have membership in states? Do we organize governance around states in a system? And clearly that choice sets up, the possibility of movement amongst states. And, there's no human rights movement, I think, that's really faced that conundrum, and we should.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess maybe going to sort of bigger picture thing about the critique that you've been raising, that you think that human rights, the sense that phrase usually used, is necessary but not sufficient, right? We should think of them along with this broader, it's important that you can't be arbitrarily arrested. It's important that you be allowed to, engage in cultural practices without despotic governments stopping you from doing it. But it's also important that we have that we have economic equality and meaningful Republican freedom and all of those things. But a point that Benjamin Gamage makes in the chat is the United States today, as you alluded to earlier, remains very far from guaranteeing even sufficiency, right?
Sure.
We're forget workers' control the means of production, even
Right.
just the sort of rights to healthcare, to education, and so on, that
Completely.
could very well fall within those sufficient rights, are often feel frustratingly hard to reach, or like they'd involve massive political struggles just to attain that. So Benjamin's question is, can it thus ever be useful strategically for socialists to focus on sufficiency?
For sure. And, I think that's very, contextual, and it's like a strategic dilemma. What I'm raising is, like, conceptually, should we say that we always put sufficient provision first, as the first priority? Because after all, I mean, there's no doubt that it's crucial in some instances. And, you could argue, I think a lot of defenders of the promotion of economic and social rights would say that whoever has them, especially if the threshold is set relatively higher, is less dominated, or maybe not dominated at all. But here's my response. It's really twofold: that it's not going to work to make sufficient provision a priority and say we'll get around to equality someday. First of all, because it doesn't happen. But second, because of this dilemma I think we're seeing in a lot of places, including the United States, that to the extent we focus solely on the worst off, we set up the possibility of a kind of malignant alliance between the rich and the poor, basically progressive neoliberalism at the expense of the working class and the middle class as well. Whereas my suggestion of embedding human rights in a broader working class project isn't abandoning human rights. It's not saying they're never a priority relative to other egalitarian ends, but it does say we can explain why the worst off and the working class, which are categories that overlap, should always be together. And we could imagine in this country a multiracial working class alliance, and the absolute and relentless priority of sufficient provision, actually, I think, is something that neoliberals have used in the past few decades, precisely to focus on the floor while obliterating the ceiling, partly as the program of the Democratic Party, not just in the Republican Party.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wonder, in terms of this other sort of strategic question about language, about whether, okay, do we try to reappropriate human rights talk for a more expansive set of rights? Do we just say, yes, human rights are very important, but so are labor rights, so are social rights? Certainly one argument that could be made for the latter position is just that, sort of the same way that sometimes we on the left tend to try to get people to take various concerns seriously by using the word violence in this really expansive way, right? As the gentrification is violence, this is violence, that's violence. And you might worry that sometimes that backfires, that, like, instead of getting people to take our concerns more seriously, they just take us less seriously. And you might worry about the same effect there, that there are different kinds of coalitions maybe that we could assemble for different kinds of projects. And it's, if we say, that things that people already take seriously under the human rights umbrella are human rights, and then we say, so the Palestinians should have those, right? Yes. Then that has a kind of rhetorical power and helps maybe assemble coalition partners in ways that it wouldn't necessarily if we just sort of start saying that absolutely everything that we want is a human right.
It's a fantastic point, and there's no right answer. I'll just tell you the way I've been thinking about it, because in some of the debates around these questions, some folks have said, well, no, human rights movements as we know them now were always committed to equality, of including income and wealth inequality, which I think is just false. But then others more persuasively say, well, they could be. The left could try to own the human rights movement. And I'm sort of skeptical of that for the following couple of reasons. First, the human rights movement is pretty fledgling and minor, and it's good at what it does, which is stigmatizing the worst despots and the worst kinds of deprivation, doesn't have any solutions. And, when bombing happens, it makes it worse. But, it's a cause that can successfully raise consciousness without doing much else. And maybe if you mess with it, you could defang it. But the bigger thing is, well, why not just build our own egalitarian movement alongside the insufficient human rights movement, and then leave open there's a general alliance with it. There are strategic and tactical alliances with it. Moments when they come together, but moments when we leave the human rights movement to do its own thing, because we have unions and hopefully a socialist party in power, maybe subject, as Tomi Nova's government definitely was, as a socialist government, to human rights critique, but it's also doing some other stuff, and is taking ownership of the egalitarian agenda too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I know I learned a lot, from this. I'm sure everybody else did also. Just kind of, well, first of all, do everybody watching this, make sure to like and subscribe, help grow this channel. Can bringing you more good content like this. I also, wanted to, so I want to remind everybody about our talk with the two Matts coming up on Friday, Matt Karp and Matt Stanley, talking about the Bernie Bros of the 19th century, Lincoln's paramilitary, the Wide Awakes, and I guess what I want to just close out with, to bring her along back to the where we started, is with one of the moments in Michael Brooks's book Against the Web, which I've been happy to see has been consistently hovering around the top 100 on Amazon in the last couple days, which if anybody who's published a book knows is kind of unbelievable. But one of the moments in there where he does frankly appeal to this kind of human rights discourse, and it's also a moment that I think shows some of his intellectual rigor, some of his humor, and most of all his warmth and humanity. So he's talking at the end about this kind of synthesis that was so important to him of cosmopolitan socialism. And he says it's entirely possible to roll your eyes at denunciations of problematic comedians and to center class in your political analysis while fighting with all your heart and soul against the Trump administration putting immigrant children in concentration camps. If you find yourself reacting to both the policing of comedy and protests against serious human rights abuses at the southern border as if there were equally unserious liberal preoccupations, you've jettisoned your sense of perspective and lost touch with important principles, not to mention your basic humanity. Rest in power, brother. That is a irreplaceable loss.